April 19th, 1961. A beach on the southern coast of Cuba. 1,400 men are stranded. They came ashore 2 days earlier, trained by the CIA, armed by the United States government, convinced they were the vanguard of a liberation army that would sweep across Cuba and topple Fidel Castro within days. Instead, they are surrounded. Their air cover has been canceled. Their supply ships have been sunk. The popular uprising they were promised never materialized. Cuban military forces, personally directed by Castro, have them pinned against the sea. By nightfall, it is over. 1,189 men are captured on the beach. The rest are dead or have escaped into the swamps. The operation has collapsed in 72 hours. In Washington, the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected to the office, in power for just 90 days, faces the cameras and takes full responsibility for the most embarrassing foreign policy failure in American history. John F. Kennedy had inherited a plan he didn't fully believe in, approved it against his instincts, and watched it collapse in real time. The world was watching, including, most importantly, the Soviet Union. What happened next would bring humanity closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before or since. This is the full story of the Bay of Pigs. To understand the Bay of Pigs, you have to understand what happened in Cuba on January 1st, 1959. For decades, Cuba had been governed by Fulgencio Batista, a military dictator with close ties to American business interests and organized crime. Havana was a playground for American tourists and mobsters. The Cuban countryside was desperately poor. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled the country. A 32-year-old lawyer turned guerrilla commander named Fidel Castro marched into Havana at the head of a revolutionary army. The revolution was genuinely popular. Castro had broad support across Cuban society, from peasants who had never owned land, from students who had been beaten in Batista's prisons, from intellectuals who had watched their country turned into an American economic colony. But within months, the nature of the revolution became clear. Castro nationalized American businesses, sugar plantations, utilities, oil refineries, without compensation. Show trials were held for Batista officials. Executions followed. Political opponents were imprisoned. Press freedom was extinguished, and Castro began accepting Soviet aid. In Washington, alarm bells rang at maximum volume. Cuba was 90 miles from the coast of Florida. A communist government, allied with the Soviet Union, nationalizing American property, potentially offering the Soviets a military base in the Caribbean, was an intolerable strategic threat. The Eisenhower administration began planning to remove Castro almost immediately. The CIA was given the job. In March 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to begin training Cuban exiles for an armed invasion of Cuba. The operation was codenamed Zapata. The plan had a certain logic to it. Cuban exiles, men who had fled Castro's revolution, who hated the new government, who wanted their country back, would be trained, equipped, and transported to Cuba. They would land on the coast, establish a beachhead, and call for a popular uprising. The Cuban people, oppressed and resentful, would rise up to join them. Castro's government would collapse from within. The CIA pointed to a precedent: Guatemala, 1954, where a CIA-organized coup had successfully toppled a left-wing government in days. Training camps were established in Guatemala. Over the following months, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, Brigade 2506, were trained in infantry tactics, amphibious assault, and guerrilla warfare. The plan assumed three things. First, that a landing force of 1,400 men could defeat Cuba's military of 32,000. Second, that the Cuban population was waiting for a spark to ignite a rebellion against Castro. Third, that American involvement could be kept secret, giving the United States plausible deniability if anything went wrong. All three assumptions were wrong. But in January 1961, before anyone could fully reckon with that, Eisenhower's presidency ended. The plan passed to his successor, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, age 43, in office since January 20th. Kennedy had campaigned on being tough on communism. He had criticized Eisenhower for allowing a communist government to take root 90 miles from Florida. He could not now, as president, simply abandon a plan already in motion, a plan that, if canceled, would release 1,400 trained Cuban exiles to tell the press that the new president had gone soft. But Kennedy had serious doubts. He asked his military advisors repeatedly, "Will this work?" The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military officers in the United States, told him the plan had a fair chance of success. They were less than honest about their actual assessment, which was considerably more skeptical. The CIA's director, Allen Dulles, was more emphatic. He told Kennedy that the Cuban Exile Brigade was a highly motivated, well-trained force and that Cuban public opinion was turning against Castro. Kennedy made one significant change to the plan. The original design called for a landing at Trinidad, a town on Cuba's southern coast with good access routes inland and proximity to the Escambray Mountains, where the exiles could retreat if the initial landing failed. Kennedy ordered the landing site changed to the Bay of Pigs, a more remote location, chosen because it was less likely to draw international attention. He also scaled back the planned airstrikes against Castro's Air Force, worried about the optics of obvious American military involvement. Both decisions would prove fatal. On April 4, 1961, Kennedy gave his final approval. The operation was a disaster waiting to happen. And it didn't have to wait long. April 15, 1961, 2 days before the landing, 8 B-26 bombers, flown by Cuban exile pilots, painted to look like defecting Cuban Air Force planes, attacked Cuban airfields. The goal was to destroy Castro's Air Force on the ground before the invasion began. The strikes were only partially successful. Castro's planes were dispersed and hidden. Several survived. More importantly, the cover story collapsed immediately. Journalists in Miami noticed that the B-26s had the wrong type of nose cone for Cuban Air Force planes. Within hours, it was clear to everyone, including the United Nations, that the United States was behind the attack. Kennedy, horrified by the exposure, canceled the second wave of airstrikes. It was the decision that doomed the invasion. April 17th, before dawn. Brigade 2506 came ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Immediately, everything went wrong. Coral reefs that CIA maps had marked as seaweed tore open the landing craft. Equipment was lost. Men struggled ashore in darkness and confusion. Castro was awake. He had been warned that something was coming and had his forces on alert. Within hours of the landing, he personally took command of the Cuban military response. He was on the radio, directing troop movements, coordinating the counterattack. The promised air cover did not come. Kennedy's cancellation of the second strike wave meant Castro's surviving planes flew freely, sinking 2 of the brigade's supply ships, including the vessels carrying ammunition and communications equipment. The popular uprising never materialized. The CIA had fundamentally misjudged Cuban public opinion. Whatever resentment existed toward Castro, it did not translate into armed rebellion when foreign-backed exiles landed on a beach. The brigade fought desperately for 2 days, outnumbered, outgunned, running out of ammunition, stranded on a beach surrounded by swamps, with no air cover and no supplies. By April 19th, it was over. 1189 men were captured. 114 were killed. The CIA's plan, 18 months in the making, costing tens of millions of dollars, had lasted 72 hours. The prisoners sat in Cuban jails for 20 months. Castro knew their value. He demanded $62 million in food and medicine as ransom, later negotiated down to $53 million, raised through private donations organized by the Kennedy administration because Congress refused to appropriate funds for it. On December 23, 1962, the last of the prisoners arrived back in the United States. Kennedy met them at the Orange Bowl in Miami. He was handed the brigade's flag. "I can assure you," he told them, "that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana." It never was. In public, Kennedy was direct. He took full responsibility. "There's an old saying," he told reporters, "that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of the government." In private, he was furious. He told aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He forced Allen Dulles and the CIA's deputy director of plans to resign. But the damage was done. Not just to Kennedy's reputation, not just to American prestige. The damage that mattered most was happening in Moscow. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had watched the Bay of Pigs with intense interest. He had already formed an impression of Kennedy from his campaign and his early presidency: young, inexperienced, uncertain. The Bay of Pigs confirmed it. Here was a president who had launched an operation and then lost his nerve halfway through, canceling the airstrikes that might have given it a chance. Here was a president who could be pushed. In June 1961, just 2 months after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy met Khrushchev face-to-face in Vienna. It did not go well. Khrushchev was aggressive, domineering, contemptuous. He issued an ultimatum on Berlin. He lectured Kennedy on the inevitable triumph of communism. Kennedy, still shaken by the Bay of Pigs, was unable to project the strength the moment required. After the summit, Kennedy told a journalist privately, "He savaged me. I've got a terrible problem if he thinks I'm inexperienced and have no guts. Until we remove those ideas, we won't get anywhere with him." Khrushchev left Vienna convinced he was dealing with a weak president, a young man who talked tough but flinched when the moment came. 16 months later, he placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days in October 1962, during which the United States and Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in history, was not inevitable. It was the product of decisions and miscalculations. The Bay of Pigs was the first and most consequential of those miscalculations. Khrushchev gambled that Kennedy would not respond forcefully to missiles in Cuba, just as he had not responded forcefully to the failure at the Bay of Pigs. He was wrong. Kennedy did respond. And for 13 days, the world held its breath. The 1,400 men of Brigade 2506 went to Cuba believing they were going to liberate their country. They were betrayed by flawed intelligence, by political calculation, by a president who approved a plan he didn't believe in, and then made it worse by half measures at the critical moment. Cuba remained under Castro's government for another 55 years. The United States and Cuba did not restore diplomatic relations until 2015. The CIA never again attempted a large-scale paramilitary operation of this type without direct military support. And John F. Kennedy, chastened, hardened, furious at himself and at the advisors who had led him wrong, became a different kind of president, more skeptical of his military and intelligence advisors, more willing to resist pressure for military action. Those lessons would matter enormously when the real crisis came 16 months later. The Bay of Pigs didn't just embarrass Kennedy. It set in motion the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war.